Okay, you are live, pops up on the screen. So that makes me think that we are in fact live. I am Eileen McGervey with One More Page Books in Arlington, Virginia. And this is our first session of our book banter series that we're going to be doing. And I am joined by Alma Katsu and Jenn Lawrence. And if you know anything about One More Page, you would know that we love these two women. Jenn can tell you about how I stalked her before the store opened to get her to come and work with us in any capacity whatsoever. And she has been running our most, our most successful book group since we opened the store. She is also a lover of all things horror. She is also the writer for Jenn's Bookshelves, her series, her blog that reviews just more books than I could ever imagine ever reading. She also has a full-time job, and she has a side business, which also seems to be a full-time job, and she has a family. So I think Jenn, I'm not saying Jenn is a whore, but I'm saying Jenn has access to some type of drug or something that allows her to have all this energy, to not have to sleep, and to still always look radiant and lovely. So whatever that is, Jenn, feel free to share that with the rest of the group. And we're super excited to also have Alma Katsu join us. Alma is an author who we have been so lucky to
stalked you.
We were very happy about it. Who we've been fortunate to have at One More Page several times. First for her Taker trilogy, which we were just discussing how that was one of our events that we always, the whole store got involved with, and we had costumes and masks and crowns, and it was always a really big deal for us because we were always excited to celebrate with Alma. And then she has now started writing books outside of the Taker trilogy, which are fantastic. The Hunger, and then this year, The Deep. And she has more coming out. She actually, yes, there it is, The Deep. And here's the Hunger. Alma had a real life too, or had a real life. I think she still does. So she also works like a crazy person, but has since moved out to West Virginia, where I bet there's a lot of horror stories out there too. So
they try. They try.
We always laugh at the store because we know that when Halloween comes around on the calendar, Jenn will try to pick a book that has horror in it. She tries to respect the sensitivities of the book group, but when the fall rolls around, there will be horror books in the in this selection. So what do you guys consider a horror book? Because there's I just was mentioning how I read something about scary books, and scary books aren't necessarily the same as horror books. Jenn, what is horror to you, since I know you've been a horror lover for forever?
To me, horror is intended to terrify you. They often focus on some of humans, the things that we're scared of the most, the dark, the unknown, and everything. When you're reading horror, you can't trust anything that's happening. Nothing is as it seems. And typically there's some character, some evil character that's beyond the bad character that's just evil. And one thing that I particularly like about horror is, when we were in middle school and high school and somebody did bad to you, and horror, that person comes back and they get revenge. And so those things like that, those don't go undone. So like Stephen King's Carrie, they were horrible to Carrie, and then she came back. So there's revenge. And then also deals a lot with, there is a lot of mythical creatures. So it is actually a lot more than what people think it is. It's more than just the gory and the bloody and that. It's a lot more than those.
Yeah, I think you pretty much encompassed, the range of feelings and elements that might be in horror. It's a very hard thing. And I mean, I couldn't even pretend to say that I could define it. Whenever I'm together with a bunch of horror writers, I always feel like, the biggest cop out. But, so the Horror Writers Association says that horror is a feeling, not a genre. It's a feeling that the writing, brings out in a person. But that can cover a lot of things. Again, I'm not like a horror expert, especially when it comes to films. But you think of films like, all those teenage slasher films. Mm-hmm. Well, how is that really different than like novels that are serial killer slashers or something like that, right?
Right.
So it's these days I tend to say that horror is a very big tent, and it's really expanded. So, for instance, after The Hunger, I was really lucky and got, because the book did so well, I was getting a lot of requests to do blurbs. And almost all of the books I got, to me, seemed more like psychological suspense. And I was looking for what was the horror element, right? Because psychological suspense, same thing. It kind of, gives you that feeling of dread and suspicion and that sort of thing. I asked myself, was it that there were supernatural tropes or elements in it? Well, not always. And yet, they still felt like horror to me, even though, when I started out, The Taker was probably closest in some people's minds to like paranormal romance, even though it wasn't quite paranormal romance. And the horror community at the time definitely did not like paranormal romance, right? They considered that outside of their scope, even though a lot of them have those supernatural tropes in them. They have werewolves and vampires and all kinds of monsters. So it's really hard to say. You can't just say, well, if it's got a werewolf, then it's horror. Although some people will, right? But the main thing is, especially these days, I think there's so much nuanced writing out there that if readers just have this sort of blanket rule, I don't read horror, they're going to freeze themselves out from some really good writing and storytelling. And this would be a good segue for the book we were discussing earlier, The Only Good Indians by Stephen Graham Jones.
Yes.
So this has been touted as a horror novel, and it definitely is. It has, as Jenn said, these unexplained things going on, this phenomena going on. But it is definitely written like literary fiction. I mean, it is beautiful, beautiful writing. And that's not to put anybody off either. I know some people are like, I don't like that highfalutin writing. It's not that. It's just that it's able to, in my opinion, convey such complex emotions with such a beautiful clarity of the writing. And it's just a superb novel, and it's been getting many, many accolades, and it deserves them all. And I'll shut up now, and I'll let you guys talk about it.
No. What I was going to say is, when I was younger, I used to read horror, and I kind of stopped that for a while. So I sort of became one of those people who was like, ugh, I don't want anything that is not real. It could be like the most gruesome, bloody murder scene, but heaven forbid there was anything a little bit like, supernatural or anything in it, I wouldn't read it. And so I read this book earlier this year, and I kind of had to get past that bias in my head that I didn't like it anymore. And this was a great one to do with because I so enjoyed it. And then also the Paul Tremblay book. So how young were you guys when you started reading horror? Because I think I started reading it in, middle school. Stephen King,
Why don't you,
Stephen King?
You go ahead. Whoops, sorry. this way.
It doesn't work the way you think.
You're not kidding.
No, it was definitely in middle school. When I was in middle school, all the Fear Street and the Christopher Pike books, the little thin books were out and were really popular. And I would devour those in like an hour. I'm like, this is not enough. I mean, because I read quickly. And so I'm like, I need more. And then I remember my 5th grade teacher they did like read along still back when I was in 5th grade. And he read Banuncula, and that's the vampire bunny.
Oh, yes.
So, but I would like devour all those books because they're thin. So my grandmother worked at a library in a small town in West Virginia. And in the summer, we would spend summers with my grandparents. And so while she was working, I would go along, and I'm trying to find the thickest books you can find in the library. That's what I needed. And that's how I found Stephen King. And I read, and so my first Stephen King was The Shining. It's my favorite, will always be my favorite, for many reasons. And that's where I went from there. I devoured horror. And then my uncle who passed away, but he was a pastor, and he saw my obsession with horror, and I'd bring home the covers of 80s horror novels were gaudy, but they're great. And then so he bought me for, I don't know if it was my birthday or Christmas, but he bought me a collection of Edgar Allan Poe. And then I got Edgar Allan Poe. I'm like, oh my gosh. So I was all over the place with horror, but very, very early. And my parents never stopped me from reading it because they would ask questions about it, and they didn't see it. I wasn't scaring anybody. I read
any rituals in the house.
No. And I read a lot. So, but it was early on. So I've been reading for like 30 years. Reading horror for 30 years. So. And my youngest likes horror. My oldest does not like horror. My husband doesn't like horror. So, like, what happened here?
That's interesting. But will they watch horror movies and TV shows?
No.
Oh, really? Okay.
My youngest will. Nobody else will.
Interesting. Because that's something I find interesting too. I'll ask people and they'll say, oh, I don't like horror. But then I'll ask them about a TV show they've seen, or, and of course they've seen the TV show or, the movie or something. And that's very frustrating. Like, where do you think those come from? But, again, I'm a little different, I guess. I wasn't really like a horror reader through most of my life, but I started out young. So I read Edgar Allan Poe voraciously when I was very young, like 8 years old.
Oh my.
I know. Well, that's what happens when your parents aren't readers, and one who's, from another country and doesn't know who Edgar Allan Poe is. So they didn't get too alarmed or anything. But I do have to say that Poe probably made like a huge impression on me, because I do lean more towards speculative fiction than what most people would think of as, like especially 80s horror, 70 and 80s horror, and more towards fantasy, maybe, and the Gothic, that sort of thing. Yeah.
Excuse me. That's what I mean. There's so many different types of horror out there because, and I mentioned this earlier, this book, Paul Tremblay, there's been a lot of buzz about his book. And, I wouldn't, until you put it on your list, Alma, I don't know that I thought about it as horror, but, this is kind of a little prescient about what's going on, but it's, a rabies type virus that is spreading very quickly, like wildfire through the state of Massachusetts. And it's about, somebody who has been bit trying to get to the hospital, and she's, having a baby, and there's nothing supernatural in it, but the virus is like a character. And so that to me is kind of like how broad horror can be.
It's sort of a zombie, and it's been a little while since I've read it, right?
Yes, there's a bit of a zombie apocalypse to it.
But it's a very realistic take on what that would be like, as opposed to the Dawn of the Dead kind of, more caricaturish thing. Yeah, I thought, first of all, the writing was outstanding, as usual with Paul. And I was very surprised that he wrote from a female point of view. Yeah. And I thought he did a really good job with that.
Well, and I was, the book came out in July. I think I read it in the winter because I had an advanced reader copy, and about how some of the things that he talks about people's reactions are not that different from what we're seeing right now with people's reaction to the, the coronavirus, with people, taking matters into their own hands in some cases, and, different reactions to it. So it's also got, some social commentary in it, which I think, Jen, back to what you were saying in terms of almost like karma, there is some social, or can be a lot of social commentary in horror, because I think you can have this entity or create this situation where the rules of logic don't always have to apply. because you've got this other force involved. So that was just.
Well, one of the things, what draws me to horror, and what has always drawn me to horror. So my educational background is psychology and criminal justice. The part I like about horror is it focuses on the darkest part of society. And it's not, and I keep saying this, it's not about the gore, it is a social commentary. So you think about the waves of horror and their popularity. So horror is coming back again, and it's been coming back progressively since, I mean, in the last handful of years. So you have to think about when horror became popular and what was going on in society. So horror was popular in World War I and the 50s and the 60s. And every time there's been a social instance of something scary that's going on in the world, horror becomes popular again, because it's an outlet for us to address those fears. We have control when we're reading horror to close the book and put it down. So we have control of how we're how scared we are and how we deal with that fear. And so that's why I say, I mean, every time it comes back, I'm like, I told you. So, I mean, so it's very interesting to see it. I think it's a lot deeper than what people think it is, but horror is really deep. If you take apart what the essence of horror and what builds a horror novel, it has a very deep premise, I would think. So.
Yeah, I mean, the books that I write, especially the last few and the one that I'm working on now, the next historical horror novel that'll be coming out in 2022, they all have social issues as the theme. And the thing about horror is it allows you to explore those social issues without necessarily pointing the finger at other humans.
Right.
And so people maybe are willing. Right. So. Right, exactly. And in the Hunger, for instance, that book was written. Now, this is where we may lose some of your viewers. That book was written during the 2016 presidential election. And when I handed the manuscript in, my editor said, you can really feel the political overtones coming through, but I swear it was a reflection of what was happening historically at the time. The Donner Party was led by a man who shouldn't have led the party. He ended up leading them into disaster. They were misled by some charlatans who were just out. One was for political reasons. The guy who said he discovered this shortcut to California lied, basically, because he was trying to bring Americans to California so that America would be forced to annex California like they did with Texas. And then the other one lied to the Wagon Party because his business was failing and he was just trying to make money off of the poor unfortunates who believed the first charlatan. That's historical fact. And yet, when you come to it hits you in the face, well, people seem to be a little bit more willing to read that in a book rather than in nonfiction,
Well, and if and here is the cover for the Hunger. Oops, I never can make it go the right way. The Hunger by Alma Katsu. The thing about it is it also, and I think this is probably true in other horror studios, takes something that we all know the story of,
right,
and looks at it in a different way, as you're discussing, from like the way of the political situation in the country at the time, but also with another force impacting these people other than just the reality that's around them. And at the beginning, it's very subtle how that starts off, in the book. And you're very wrapped up with the story itself. And then Alma, you kind of like slowly start easing in these feelings and mentions and it does a really good job of building up the tension threshold.
Thank you. I mean, that's what I like. I don't know about you guys, but that's what I do like in, most books, but certainly in horror. I prefer that kind of slow burn as opposed to this sort of slam bam. I mean, I think most horror does well with that, although you can certainly think of horror movies and, which are a bit more like a thriller, right? Explosive and just one thing after another. And that was one thing that I wanted to bring up too, just how popular horror is getting. Jenn, referred to that as well. But if you're not in the industry, you may not think about it, but there's been a good drought of over 20 years where horror was sort of a bad word in the publishing business. They took away the horror sections in bookstores. A lot of it ended up going to fantasy, for instance, or, some of it that was science fiction tinged would go to science fiction, or in other corners of the bookstore. Well, now in the last year or two, we've been seeing bookstores bringing horror sections back. And, books actually proclaiming themselves as horror novels as opposed to just fantasy. And I think a lot of it actually has to do with streaming services, actually, since the last few years, when streaming services just had this enormous appetite for original content, they ended up turning to a lot of horror stories. Right. And, it's a good percentage now. Horror represents a good percentage of what we see on streaming services. And that sort of thing in original movies. And I think it's just helping to feed this appetite for horror stories. Almost everybody I know as a horror writer has a show on Hulu or Amazon or something. It's very frustrating.
Well, it's as a bookseller, it's interesting because we do kind of go in cycles of how we organize books in the store. And we also sometimes hear feedback from authors about not wanting their book in a certain section, because they're afraid that says something about them as an author. We'll sometimes have mystery writers who don't want their books in the mystery section. They feel that somehow diminishes them. They want them in the fiction section, the literary section. And I think horror kind of suffers from that as well, in that, sometimes people might not want their book to be classified that way because they think there are people who will just not even be interested in looking at it or even looking at that section because they think that they don't like that, like me.
Right.
Yeah.
But then it's challenging, though, for those who do read horror. So when I'm looking for books that are coming out in publishing in the next 4 to 6 months, I want to schedule what I'm going to read and review. I sort by genre. I want to know, where's the horror? And then there's 4 books. I know there's more than this. Then you have to look down psychological thriller and all this. This is it's okay to be a horror. It's okay to be horror. And I think that it's frustrating because there is a fandom out there that you might not be reaching because you're not being categorized the right way.
Right. And someone mentioned in the chat about Wattpad horror books. I don't know if either one of you are familiar with that. It's a site that has stories about horror books, or I think different genres, but it's a place for people to go and look at those as well. So that's Wattpad horror books. So it sounds like neither one of you is familiar with that, but I have heard of Wattpad.
Yeah, Wattpad, I don't know if it's changed, but a few years back when I was a little bit more familiar with it, it was a platform basically for content. Again, I don't know if it's changed, but for a lot of writers, it became problematic because people were plagiarizing published works and publishing them on the platform under their names.
Yeah.
So I would just say, be careful when you go to Wattpad. By all means, discover self-published writers there. But unfortunately, for a while, it did have this reputation of plagiarizing writers' works.
Alma, we were talking earlier about, women writers in horror. And I think a lot of times, when you think about the writers that we mentioned at the very beginning, Stephen King, Edgar Allan Poe, we tend to associate, I think that more with men, even though we have Mary Shelley, Frankenstein, which I would consider a horror book. But do you think that there are more women writing horror, or just that there's maybe more awareness of it or more opportunity for it?
Probably everything that you said. So, there's definitely been a change in the weather. When I first started writing, getting published, I should say, which has been 10 years now, hard to believe. But for my first book, I outreached to every writing community that my book touched on. So, it was probably closest to paranormal romance. I think it's closest to early Anne Rice, which was thought of as horror, but also literary fiction. So I did reach out to the horror community, and they were not interested. The horror community at the time was very much dominated by guys who were into splatter punk or closer to that, more physical kind of stuff. and I think other women have told me too that they felt kind of ostracized by the community, that there wasn't a place for the kinds of things that they were interested in. And, that's like 180 degrees now. There's so many women writers in horror. And I think to a certain extent, we take our cue also from movies. There's been in the last few years, so many more movies, horror movies by women directors, written by women. And if you watch them, you'll see that they just feel very different. The kinds of fears that they delve into are pretty different than like your male slasher film or something. I think of the movie The Babadook is a real example of that, right? A terrifying movie, amazingly visual, but it really gets to this single mother's fears, right? That a guy director probably wouldn't have been able to hit as well. And that's when I think of that, that's what I think women's fiction is sort of like, that we just hone in on different fears.
Jenn, there's actually a question for you, and I think one of these is a Mexican Gothic. I know is written by a female author. And what are your thoughts? Because I think you've read Mexican Gothic. There it is, right there. All right. She was ready, Ellen.
I was. I do think this is horror, because let me tell you, I read this book and I had the strangest dreams. It takes you to like a completely different place. I usually don't remember my dreams. It takes a lot to scare me. Like I said, I read a lot of horror, but this one took me to a completely different. It's very visual, very visual. So I definitely think it's like a Gothic horror. I haven't read The Catherine House. I do have The Catherine House. I haven't read it yet, but I definitely do think Mexican Gothic would be considered Gothic horror.
Yeah, and that's just been blowing up everywhere. I read the beginning. I just haven't had a chance to finish it yet, but I was on a panel with Sylvia Moreno Garcia, and she is brilliant. Yeah. So if her writing is half as brilliant as her speaking, I would say it's got to be a tremendous book.
Yeah, and I don't like to read books when people are talking about them. I want to wait until it's like calm down. But I'm like, you know what? It was like calling to me. So I'm like, and I did, and I'm so glad, because it's completely unlike anything I've read recently. So I do. That's one of the books I would recommend if you want to try out horror, or you're like middle line horror. Definitely try that out. It's really good.
Hey, as long as we're talking about like gateway drugs to horror, I'd like to give a shout out to Anthologies. I think they're a good way to, without making the commitment of a whole book. There's a ton of great anthologies. They're both published by the Big Five, as well as a lot of really good ones coming out of small press. And I'm going to give a shout out to two, just because I have them right here. One is Miscreations, and it's written backwards press. So this is a small press. You're not going to find it in a lot of stores, but if you look for it online, I had the honor of writing the foreword to it. This is one of the strongest anthologies I've ever read. It's all about the relationship between man and monster. And, as I say, there's only men are monsters. I mean, they're creations of our imaginations. They're creations of our lives. It's a wonderful anthology, and it's not like gory and jump cutty kind of horror. It's really going to make you think about the origins of evil and its relationship to ourselves. And this is one I also did the foreword to recently. Sorry, I'm still figuring out the camera here.
And I never figured it out, and I use it all the time. I think that endears us to people, that we're not like super professional.
That's great. Yes.
Also drinking while we're doing it, because it's book banter. We're banter.
There we go. So this is Black Cranes, and it just came out. And again, this is a small press, but it's stories. It says horror stories by Asian women writers. It's actually like a mix of science fiction, fantasy, horror, but they all have this sort of horror tinge. And so I'm half Asian. I grew up being considered Asian, and there's just certain things about being an Asian woman that makes life pretty sucky. And so these books really capture it well. So if that's of any interest to you, I encourage you to seek it out. Black Cranes, edited by Lee Murray and Genevieve Flynn, and everybody in there, all the, like I said, all the authors are Asian, and a lot of them come from the Far East. And I'm not talking like Japan and China, they're Philippines, Indonesia, that sort of thing. It's really interesting collection.
Well, I put the titles of those books and the editors in the notes so that people can follow up on them if they want. And I think, Ellen, I think that you have given me these books by John Connolly, who I thought of him just as a mystery or thriller kind of writer, and then I started reading this one, which came out a little while ago, and all of a sudden it was like supernatural creepiness crept in. So it sounds like you guys have both heard of him. So yes. So thank you, Ellen, for sharing that with me. His new book that came out this year. Is actually one of my picks for the year, and so is in our list of books that we picked for the year. One of the other ones you mentioned, Alma, which I have not read this, but I'm hear about this author all the time. So maybe you could talk about this book.
Sure. Did you read that, Jen?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Did you want to take the lead and then I can jump in? Or
okay. So that is the sequel to Bird Box. Bird Box was popular. There's a movie with Sandra Bullock. We read it for a book club a number of years ago during one of my horror picks. And I mean, I didn't know how they were going to follow up Bird Box. Like, what are you going to do with it? I mean, it was pretty intense, but it was the best follow-up book that I have ever read. I'm like reading it and I'm like, it can't get better than this. It can't get better than this. And then I finished it. And I'm like, I have never been so satisfied after reading a book.
All right.
Because it was just perfect. It was perfect. And again, it's dealing with the people. It's dealing with the people that were in Bird Box and others that they met along the way, and then afterward. But it was great. It was great.
I mean, if people who are watching us, if you enjoyed Bird Box, either the movie or the book, but you were like, oh, I don't know about a sequel. I loved Bird Box for what it was. Should I really go? Absolutely, you should, because I felt the same way. I thought that was one of the best sequels I've ever read. And the other thing I'll say is I am a huge Josh Malerman fan.
Yes.
Josh is an artist. I mean, we've met now, we know each other, and I just so respect him as an artist. A lot of us grapple with these petty commercial concerns. Will this story sell? Josh does not think of that. No. Josh can write. Every book of his is different and incredibly artistic. He's like a high wire trapeze artist. I just respect him so much. Every one of his books is like an artistic journey.
And it's funny. I think we have him in our mystery section. And maybe when we first opened, we actually had a section called The Undead, because that was when all the vampire, zombie, werewolf.
Was the Taker in the Undead section?
No, that was actually in the literary fiction section.
Oh.
But we don't have that anymore. So now we don't have a good place for those books. So we'll have to have some consultation with you, Jen, about what we could move into a horror book, or at least to like notate in our system. Yeah. When somebody's looking for horror, that it comes up.
Yeah. Every once in a while, Lelia will email me. She's like, where should we shelve this in the store? I'm like, this is definitely this. This is definitely it. Yeah. So I have strong feelings about it.
I think you mentioned like a gateway drug book. What would be, for both of you, what would be like a good gateway book for somebody who hasn't read horror, but thinks they might like to give it a try?
Yeah.
Do you want to go first, Jen?
Sure. I have a list. The one that I think most people were talking about, and they're like, they didn't realize it was horror. The Southern Book Club's Guide to Slaying a Vampire.
And
I was going to show my cover, but my cover doesn't have the cover on it. I don't like covers. So that's not going to be helpful. But it was really good. I mean, and that it touches on things that terrify you. It's a little bit, it's a little bit scary for those who haven't read. I thought it was brilliant. I thought it was great. It was very unique. But then also, if you want to go toward like the classics, you can also always, I read like Frankenstein and Dracula and all those in high school, and I didn't appreciate them in high school, and then I read them now, and they're like, this is amazing. Haunting of Hill House, read the book. Don't base your Haunting of Hill House on the TV series or Blythe Manor. None of that is turning a screw. I would read the book, as always, but I think those are great. And I always say, so for me, recommending horror is really difficult. I just don't do like general recommendations. I'm like, what are you afraid of? What are your trigger warnings? Because I try to avoid all these things. I don't mind reading things that scare me. But if somebody's terrified of spiders, I'm not going to have them read something that has spiders. Or I think it's definitely a more personal recommendation, I think, than a general wide recommendation, I would say. But Mexican Gothic was one of them. Grady Hendrix, Riley Sager, all of those, they're like easing you into the dark and scary stuff.
One of the books that I love is The Little Stranger by Sarah Waters.
Yeah.
And I mean, I love it so much that first of all, I think it's really hard to write an original ghost story.
Yeah.
And that one that works, but that is definitely one. However, if you're like a breakneck pace kind of person, you may not like the book, but it's amazing book. And it really, I think, kind of turned the ghost story genre on its head a little bit. And I just love Sarah Waters, like all her books. But what's interesting is I read an interview with her that she did after the book came out. And, the book won all kinds of accolades. And she said she did not start it out as to be a haunted house story. It was just another one of her historical fiction, but she just couldn't get it to work. And this idea came into her head, and thank God it did. And I personally tend towards Gothic stories anyway. I just love Gothic. So like Dracula is actually just a fantastic example of the Gothic. If you want to write horror, I suggest you read Dracula and break down all the plot points, and you'll really learn a lot about how to write a horror story from that. Speaking of which, I'll plug one of my own books. If you kind of like horror, but not sure that you'd like a big, messy story. The Deep is it's a historical reimagining, and this one is of the sinking of the Titanic and its sister ship, the Britannic, and it's supposed to be reflective of the time, which was the end of the Gilded Age. So it's, very lush and romantic and Gothic without a lot of scares, and it just takes you a while to sort of understand what's really going on in there because it has an unreliable narrator. Imagine that.
I love the unreliable narrators in books. I never knew what the term was for that until I got into book selling, and I'm like, oh yeah. And now I use that in real life too, because sometimes you talk to people and they're like, they're an unreliable narrator of their own life. I want to get back to talking about writing in a minute, but I have to ask you guys, what is the scariest book that you ever read?
Kill Creek by Scott Thomas. I read that like 3 years ago, 3-4 years ago. This time of year, I mean, I read horror year round, but something about reading it this time of year, it had all the things that make me. I mean, my favorite kind of horror. I love ghost stories. That's my thing. Gothic and ghost stories. That's what I love. My favorite horror movie is The Exorcist. It still terrifies.
Me too.
It still terrifies me. But I think recently that's the one. But it takes a lot to scare. It takes a lot to scare me now.
Build up your tolerance.
I know it does. So when I'm recommending books like book club, I say I need a spooky, not spooky book, because my what I call spooky, nobody wants to read because it's terrifying. So I use Twitter to help me. I'm like, all right, Twitter, what do you think what is a good scary book? And we did Slade House this year. Ellen actually reminded me how much I love that book. I did a reread, and it is great. But it's been a long time since something really, really scared me.
Yeah, that's a hard question for me to answer because, as I've said, I'm not really like into horror canon. I don't, like go out of my way to make sure I read all the horror. I read a little bit more because, you know, I have to stay on the genre a little bit more. But also because for many years I had a really horrific job where I had to deal with mass murders. When I say mass, I mean like thousands of people. Yeah. And, you know, once you've been exposed to that, it's really hard to be scared, you know, because there's a clown in the woods. So,
Right.
So it just, I mean, literally, we will watch horror shows on TV, and then I'll just get up and take the dogs into the woods, right, to do their business.
No.
It does nothing, and I don't mean to like be glib about it, but yeah, literally, when people are being slaughtered around you, you know, by the dozens.
Right. When I mentioned that my background is psychology and criminal justice, so when I was in college, we were young college students. We went into prisons and we interviewed serial killers, and that is terrifying to me. Like real monsters are terrifying to me. So that's why, like, how can you read horror? I'm like, well, I've already met the real life monsters. I mean, what else is going to scare me? So
yeah, and that kind of is like when I write in my villains, I try to show people really what evil, demented people are like, right? Yeah. Because it's not, you know, what exists in real life is pretty terrifying. Yeah. And a contrived evil, you know, while it's good because you can control it and everything, it really can't compare. And the thing is we have the real thing in the world, and unfortunately some of us in our lives today.
Yeah, and I agree with you on that, because I think one of the scariest books I ever read, and I'm embarrassed that I probably will say the title wrong, is I'll Be Gone in the Dark.
Yes.
Yeah.
I read that book, and it's a true crime book for anyone who hasn't read it, about the Golden State Killer. And I could only read small parts of that, and I like triple checked everything in my house because, you know, it just was so vividly written, but it was also real.
Yeah.
So would you consider, do you consider true crime or things like that horror?
Well, horror is technically fictional.
Okay.
But all thrillers, I mean, okay, so all horror have thriller in them, but not all thrillers are horror.
Yes. Okay.
So that is a real life horror to me.
Yes.
I listened to that audiobook, and
oh my goodness,
driving home at night, I'm like getting, I couldn't even look in the back seat. I'm like, what's going to happen? It was just terrifying. It was terrifying. Yeah. So that's what scares me. Horror doesn't scare me.
Yeah. I mean, that was a terrifying book. That is one of the books that I recall at least gave me pause. Like I would read a section, I'm like, you know, I didn't like stop and put it in the freezer or anything, but even just, you know, to give me pause is something. And I think it was because of the way that she wrote it, that, you know, because I do like true crime. I find it very interesting, but, you know, a lot of those guys, it's interesting. If you talk to FBI, right, profilers and stuff, the kind of person that becomes a serial killer is fairly obvious, you know, that if you run across them in everyday life, if you have any survival instinct whatsoever, you're going to like at least stand back from the person, right? Like, maybe I won't invite that guy over for dinner. So, you know, she did a really good job at making it so visceral and everything. So I think in that case, it was the way the story was told that brought it closer to horror.
Right.
What's it? Sally, one of our booksellers at the store, Sally McConnell, said she read In Cold Blood when she was in high school, and it disturbed her sleep for several nights. And again, back to sometimes the, you know, things that are real right around us can be so vividly written that even though we're not in that place, we feel like that could be us.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'll See You in the Dark. I forget the title. Everyone knows that book, right? That was one where I felt like, you know, this guy could be in my neighborhood.
Exactly.
Yeah. But Jenn, you know, we kind of have joked a few times about how you use October and the fall as a way to kind of slide in some books that have a horror aspect to them. How does your book group respond to that? How do they, do they kind of, how do they respond to that?
Well, they know, they're like, October's coming up. They're ready. There hasn't really been anything. I mean, when we read Bird Box, they were pretty terrified with Bird Box, but everything I pick, it's very tame as far as horror. And a lot of it is classic. We read, like I said, we read Bird Box, we read Slade House, we read Little Strangers, the other ones we read, but they're all pretty tame, like not too scary. And there were some that were scared, but that's why before I picked them, I'm like, I don't want to terrify somebody who doesn't want to be terrified.
Right.
So they're all pretty tame.
Do you have some people who just don't read that month?
Nope. Everybody will read. Everybody will read.
That's good that they're open-minded to trying different things, to that. So, I just, like I said, we all kind of joke about it, and I just wondered what their reaction was to it. Sally also mentioned Devil in the White City, which is also very scary.
Yeah, that's good. Yeah.
Was that Eric Larson's book?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay, that's one of his I haven't read.
Yeah. Who is your favorite? Do you have a favorite author who's like your horror go-to? When you hear that person, if they're still alive, has a new book coming out that you're like, I'm going to pre-order that now, even though it's not going to come out for a year.
Beyond Stephen King. I will.
How about his sons?
Yeah, I like Joe Hill.
Yeah.
So funny thing, before Joe came out and said he was his son, I read his book, Heart-Shaped Box. I'm like, this reads like Stephen King. This is uncanny. And then it was like a year and a half, 2 years later that he came out. I'm like, I knew it. Because I know Stephen King's and so, yeah, I'm sure he's pretty tired of being compared to being Stephen King's son. But I mean, it's all of his books I'll read. And Owen's books I've read as well. So it's a really and Tabitha as well. So it's a really talented family.
Yeah, really.
Scary to be around them, though.
Yeah.
Alma, is there anyone who you love to read?
Maybe I shouldn't say this, but there's only a few authors that I pretty much will read anything they write. And they tend to be more in the mystery thriller area, believe it or not. I really like Danielle Trussoni's writing. We didn't mention The Ancestor, but I'd like the opportunity to bring it up now because I thought that was a really, really amazing book as a writer.
I was disappointed because we were actually supposed to have an event with you and Danielle, right? I think like the week the pandemic, when we closed everything down, and it was such a disappointment to have to cancel that event.
Maybe in the future, but I just felt as a writer, she was so daring, and I don't want to give any spoilers away, so I can't say, but the book kind of goes in a certain trajectory, and you think you know where it's going to go, and then it does this weird turn that is still completely organic to the story. And I love Gothic, and it's an extremely Gothic tale, and just so well done. So that's another one that I think could be a gateway drug. Like if you just go in for the fine writing, stay for the unexpected thing. Yeah.
How do Alma, since you're The Hunger and now The Deep, I noticed you've been on a lot of panels with other writers of the horror genre. Do you feel like you belong there? Do they feel like they belong there?
They were very nice to me. I think The Hunger and The Deep do fit into the horror genre so well. So, but I don't feel like I belong there because, like with Paul Tremblay, Paul really knows horror inside and out. He's just been invested in it his whole life, and so he really understands it well. Same thing with what's his name, Grady Hendrix, and Stephen Graham Jones. They've all been foot soldiers in the horror army for a long time, so they just kind of put up with me. They know I'm not going to have the deep bench knowledge, but I can say funny things occasionally.
Do you don't feel any kind of you don't feel like you don't want to be classified as a horror novelist, right? Like
no.
we were talking earlier about how people are a little like reluctant to be assigned a certain genre, but it really is important to have I think for readers to know where your books fit and things.
It is. I mean, that's the first thing they tell you when you sign a contract is, we need to know which bookshelf your book is going to go on in the store. Having readers find you is so difficult. Yeah. I mean, it's one thing if your book is squarely a particular genre, and I don't mean that as a negative term, just like the kind of book it is, like it's a romance or it's women's fiction or it's a mystery. But unfortunately, so many books really kind of cross genres. And then the question is, where do you go? And if you end up being on that mystery shelf, for instance, you're not a square and true mystery, some people are going to get mad at you when they read your book.
Yeah.
And you lose readers either way. It's really tough. It's really, really tough. So, yeah, I mean, I've had horror readers respond by saying it's not horror enough. When I can just beg them, please, it's going to make somebody happy, maybe not you. Just be a little, patient, right? Don't slam us on Amazon because it wasn't horror enough for you. I think most people are pretty understanding, but it's like food, right? Everybody's taste is unique. Yeah. And, you can't expect every book to be exactly what you want. And if you're a little open, maybe you're going to read something that is going to delight you that you never would have expected would delight you.
I was going to say, and that's the thing is, bookstores and, book bloggers and, panel discussions and things are an opportunity for people to be exposed to something that they otherwise might not have picked up. And, that's what's kind of cool about it. Like, I was fortunate. I have hit it now. The Hunger, I was fortunate to get an arc of that, to be able to read it. And, and I loved it. If I hadn't gotten an arc, I don't know that I would have picked it up. Not because I wouldn't have been interested in it, but just because there's so many books out there that everyone's trying to pick from that it's really helpful when people are open to not just reading the same author all the time or the same type of book. I'm
curious, with both of you, do you think readers are getting less open, that they come in and they have very preconceived notions about who and what they want to read, or has that improved? Because like when I was a kid, I think the thing that made me a writer is, I read so much when I was a kid. I was one of those introverted, lonely children. So I spent all my time in the library. I mean, all my time. And I didn't know, right? So I would literally just pull books off the shelves and started reading. And I think that's partly what makes me still to this day sort of an open reader. Do you think people just don't do that anymore?
I'm a picky reader. I mean, but I am open. I'm open to, I take recommendations all the time that aren't normally what I'd read. But I do, though, who I take those recommendations from, that list is very small. But they know. I mean, they know what I'm going to read. Like, I don't read fluffy books. I don't read happy books. I don't read. I mean,
I don't want any joy.
No, I don't.
No joy in my books.
I don't like what people could call beach reads. I don't read them. I want books that like make me really, really think. Because my reading time, even though we're all at home now, my reading time is very limited. So what I do read, I'm still very picky about. I'm still very picky about what I read. But again, but I'm open to recommendations always.
Yeah, I mean, I was going to say, one of the things that I think is important about a bookstore is, and we've kind of have always said this about the store, is it's a place of exploration and discovery. Right. When we first opened the store, I had all the New York Times bestsellers, all the IndieNext bestsellers stocked in prominent positions, and we didn't sell very many of them because people already know about that. Right. They want to know what they want to find something they didn't know anything about.
Right.
So a lot of times we laugh about it. People will come in and we'll be, oh, can we help you with something? And they'll be like, no, I'm just looking. And, they kind of need time to walk around and orient themselves and to look and see what catches their eye. And then they might talk with us about stuff. But I think that is one of the big differences between like an Amazon and to a much lesser extent now, Barnes and Noble, is that, we're not, I love Stephen King. I love, a lot of these other big authors. They're great, but they don't need us to advertise them.
Right.
People are going to buy that. So what we, have found since the very beginning is people want to learn about new authors, things they wouldn't have picked up otherwise, or that maybe they just heard on the radio. And so I think there are a lot of people who are open to reading new things. And I know for us, we're so fortunate to get a lot of advanced books, and also to be in communication with readers all the time that, I'll take recommendations from some readers and in our store who I know read stuff that I like or that I respect. And, the publishers all have, salespeople that we work with, and when they are passionate about a book, they like, keep it in front of you and tell you why it's so great. And they get you to read stuff that you wouldn't necessarily have picked up otherwise. And because they're passionate about it, they love it.
Well, that's heartening to hear from both of you. And I have to say, I'm not surprised. Because your store is just so amazingly curated. I mean, it really is this jewel box where, there's an embarrassment of riches. There's so many like amazing books that you never would have heard about, or, for most of us, it doesn't cross our radar, that you guys are aware of. It's easy. It's an easy store to spend a lot of time in. And it's not just the books. No. Like I buy so much of my wine at your store.
Yeah. Well, I was going to say, one of the things that, we've really tried to keep up on during this, the pandemic, when we can't have people in the store, is, our, what we call OMP reads, where one of us will talk about a book that we love and why we love. And it's just a short little snippet, but it's, books that we love and, want to share with people. And I know that's what Jenn does through her blog and through the book group. And, you become a champion for a book, because there are thousands and thousands and thousands of books that come out every Tuesday.
Exactly. And that's one of the things that, the book club members say, Fiction Book Club says, I never would have read this book if you hadn't picked it. And I still pick every single book. And I've offered, it's all these years I'm still picking the books. And I've offered, I don't have to pick the books anymore. Like, no, you pick books that we wouldn't have read normally. And I get pitched books. People know that I'm the book club leader at One More Page, and I'll get emails and like, it won this award, it won this award, it won this award. And I'm like, no, I don't want the books that won this award, and this award. I want the books that people don't know about yet. Yeah. And I need that and get people to read it.
And sometimes it's sometimes I like to sit in and listen to the book clubs, even if I haven't read the book, because I love the discussions, and I especially love it when there's a lot of dissension about the book. I mean, and it's just, you get so much more out of it, hearing other people's takes on things, which is, I think, like what a review or a blog post is like too, is it helps you pick up aspects of the book that maybe you didn't pick up on your own. Because I also read fast, Jenn, but I am not a good reader. I am a kind of scanning it reader, which is not really good when you're reading mysteries, because you miss a lot of clues that way. But the reviews help me with that. So anyway, any closing words? We have like 1 minute left here. What are you reading right now, Jenn?
Oh gosh, what am I reading right now? It's on my Kindle. I'm drawing a blank now.
Okay, Alma, what are you reading right now?
This always happens to me too. Well, right now I'm reading a book called The Drowning Kind, which is it's not out yet. It's for a blurb. It's Jennifer McMahon, my friend Jennifer McMahon, who writes. Yeah, she's a good crossover too. She is. She's an excellent crossover. And so far it's wonderful. And I'm upset that I don't have more time to read it. I'm trying to think. And then I also have on deck Christopher Golden's next book, Red Hands. But I can't say anything because I haven't even cracked it open yet. So what about you? What are you reading?
I was just trying to remember that. I was so excited because I just got this new, and it's a mystery book. It's called Slough House, and it's by Mick Herron. And I just books. It's a mystery book, and it's about disgraced MI5 agents in London and how they actually end up solving a lot of espionage that's going on. But the characters are incredible. So that just came in the mail and made my day today. And Jen's feverishly trying to look at what she.
The Hollow. It's driving me crazy. It's The Hollow Places. A woman horror writer. Really good. She writes dark and creepy and all the things I like. So that's who I'm reading.
Yay!
It's crazy though, because I'm been talking about these other books, but not reading. I'm like, oh my gosh, I have so many books in my head right now.
Well, thank you guys for joining us for our first book banter, and thanks for everyone who joined in and listened to us banter about horror books today. I tried to put as many of them as I could catch as we were going along, titles and authors in the notes there. And if you want to go back and watch it again, you can on YouTube or Facebook. But thank you.
Thank you.
Good to see you guys again. Thanks, Alma.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.